Thank you so much for joining us for this talk, Helen Frankenthaler in Her Time and Now. I'm Siwa from the gallery and also the curator for this show, which I'm very happy and honored to have done for an incredible artist and her artworks. The exhibition, Helen Frankenthaler Prints, 1977 to 2004, in fact, is our annual special exhibition, where we feature remarkable works in printmaking and papermaking by some of the most significant modern and contemporary artists in history. Past annual special exhibitions have included works by Takashi Murakami, Picasso, and Zhao Wuqi, among many others. The works that you see all around you here today actually belong to the National Collection of Singapore, as well as some that were generously loaned by the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation in New York. They give us an insight into the extremely varied and skilled printmaking experiments by the artist, who has been long recognized as one of the great American artists of the 20th century. Majority of these works were also produced in collaboration with American master printer Kenneth Tyler, an important figure in the establishment of STPI. So it really is a pleasure to present these works to our audience, given that these works echo STPI's spirit of collaboration and the bold experimentations that take place in our creative workshop. I also had the honor to introduce our speaker for the day, Ms. Elizabeth Smith, who is the Executive Director of the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation in New York. I'd like to thank her for making this very, very long trip all the way from New York to Singapore to join us for our opening week. So just a little bit about our speaker. She is the founding executive director of the foundation since 2013, and thus her extensive and extremely in-depth knowledge on the life and practice of the artist. She was previously the executive director of curatorial affairs at the Art Gallery of Ontario, Toronto, chief curator and deputy director of programs at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, and the curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles. She has written and curated for a great number of artists, among her many other accolades. So without further ado, I'll pass over the time to Elizabeth to begin the talk. Can we all put our hands together to welcome our speaker?
Thank you, Siwa, for that nice welcome and introduction. And it's a pleasure to see all of you here today. I'm very happy to be here in Singapore. It's my first time here. And when I learned that STPI wanted to put on an exhibition of Helen Frankenthaler's prints, it seemed like a fantastic opportunity, not just to come here, but to understand more about the relationship between Kenneth Tyler and the Tyler Graphics Workshop, and how it served as the precedent for STPI and its activities today. So this visit has been a marvelous learning opportunity for me as well. I'm going to speak for maybe about 40 minutes about Helen Frankenthaler's life and work. And because I am not an expert in printmaking, I thought it would be most instructive or informative for this audience if I spoke about her entire career, both as a painter and as a printmaker, which I hope will help give some context to the works that you see around you. To begin, can everybody see the screen well enough, or is it possible to dim the lights a little bit? I don't know. If it is possible, I think it would be great because you'll be able to see the images a bit better. I hope that helps. So originally, I thought to title this talk, Helen Frankenthaler in Her Time and Now. And that is what I'm going to talk about. But then I came up with the idea of a subtitle that I thought would be suitable for this exhibition, which is Helen Frankenthaler, Poet of the Surface. And that phrase is taken directly from a writing by a poet in the 1960s who wrote about Helen Frankenthaler's work and called her a poet of the surface, which is a really appropriate way to think about her work as a painter as well as a printmaker. Helen Frankenthaler was born in 1928 in New York City, and she died in 2011. And I wanted to show you some of the headlines from the obituaries that were published at the time of her death, where you can see how she was referred to as an abstract painter who shaped a movement, and as an artist who is remembered for her influence. I also very much like this grouping of images because you can see photos of the artist as a young woman, as a middle-aged painter, and as an older figure. And she did have a career that spanned 6 decades. Frankenthaler knew from a very early age that she wanted to be an artist. She studied art first in high school, and her first art teacher was the Mexican muralist Rufino Tamayo, who at that time was teaching high school art in New York City. Helen Frankenthaler had the great opportunity to study with him, and from him, she first began to learn about modern art and about Cubism, which was at that time still considered an avant-garde modern movement. She went on to Bennington College, which was a small liberal arts university, which had a great focus and specialization on the arts, literature, etc. And she's shown here as a university student painting with her professor Paul Feely standing behind her. Paul Feely would also go on to become a well-known artist in his own right. And then just the year after graduating from Bennington College, she went to study at the summer school of the German emigre painter Hans Hofmann, who had established a school both in New York City and then in the summertime in an artist colony in Provincetown, Massachusetts, which was a seaside town. If you see Helen Frankenthaler here and take a look at the painting on the easel, you can see that she was working in this style of Cubism still at that moment. But soon upon graduating from university, she returned to her native New York and set up her own studio. And at that time, 1950, 1951, she was immersing herself in a small avant-garde community of artists who would later become well known as major pioneers of mid-century painting. At this time, though, she's making works that are quite strong, quite striking for a young artist in her early 20s, and absorbing a lot from the other work that she saw being made around her in the studios of New York by people ranging from Arshile Gorky to Adolf Gottlieb to Willem de Kooning, all of whom were active in the New York City of that time. This may be a harder one for you to see, but I wanted to show it to you because it's a poster from an exhibition called the 9th Street Show of Painting and Sculpture that took place in 1951. And it was a significant exhibition because it was the first time that the artists who would later become known as the Abstract Expressionists were gathered together with a show of their work. And if you can see some of the names in the poster, you will recognize the names of people like Robert Motherwell, Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, and others who are now very well-known figures in the pantheon of mid-century American painting. Helen Frankenthaler was the youngest artist to participate in that show, and she also had the largest work in the show, which gives you a little bit of an idea of how ambitious she was as a young artist and how she really, had her eye on the prize of what she wanted to do in moving her career forward. It was the painting of Jackson Pollock that impressed her the most. It made the strongest impact on her as a young artist who was looking at everything else being done around her. And she would have seen this painting at one of Pollock's early exhibitions in 1950. The aspect of his painting that most impressed her was its freedom, its spontaneity, its quality of immediacy. And as you probably all know, Jackson Pollock painted by dripping pigment onto the surface of a canvas laid flat on the ground. And he moved all around the painting to achieve a result of a kind of all-over composition with no beginning and no end. Frankenthaler, in seeing his works, became so inspired that she decided she had to try to do something similar to Pollock in terms of ambition and innovation. She began that slowly. This is a work that she would have made shortly after seeing Jackson Pollock's work, and you can see the extreme horizontality of this piece and a similar kind of overall composition to this form, but of course a palette, a color palette that's extremely different from Jackson Pollock's, and also a reference in terms of subject matter and theme. It's named after a popular jazz club in New York that she and her friends liked to frequent. Here's another image that shows that piece that I just showed you before, so you can get a better idea of how large it is in comparison to other works that she made around the same time. And it is a painting on paper. So Frankenthaler became friendly with Jackson Pollock and with his wife Lee Krasner, and also with the eminent art critic Clement Greenberg. And this photo of the four of them together shows them out at a jazz club one evening. That was a favored activity of this community of young and middle-aged avant-garde artists at the time. Helen Frankenthaler also had the opportunity to visit Jackson Pollock's studio, so she could actually observe his techniques and have a very close relationship with how he made his paintings. So this was an even more valuable experience to her, to be able to get up close and personal with the artist. Here you see her together with Lee Krasner and Clement Greenberg in front of Jackson Pollock's studio with a Pollock painting hanging on the wall of the barn-like structure in which he painted. So shortly after being exposed to Pollock and his method of painting, she created her first work that was truly innovative in that she established a new technique. She took oil paint and she thinned it down with turpentine to a very watery consistency, almost like watercolor. And she laid a canvas, an unprimed canvas, right on the floor. And she poured the paint from a can onto the surface, on and around the surface of this large canvas. And once the paint was poured, she manipulated it using various tools to create the kind of compositional effect that she wanted. The result was something that became known as the soak stain technique, because the pigment soaked directly into the canvas and stained it. And it was an approach that was stimulated by and inspired by, but different from what Jackson Pollock had done before her. And the resulting composition is, as you can see, quite different from Pollock's tight, dense, overall composition. There's a great deal more sort of airiness and openness, and also a color palette that is much more light and pastel-like. She titled the piece Mountains and Sea because it also referenced a trip she had made a few months earlier to a seaside area of Nova Scotia, which is in Canada, which has a very dramatic coastal landscape where the mountains literally meet the sea. So land and sea come together in a powerful way. And she described this painting as resulting from the landscape being in her arm when she made it. So which also gives you an idea of the effect that she was trying to convey in her art, not a direct representation of a landscape, but rather a translation of the mood or the feeling that she had experienced from this powerful landscape. Once she mastered the soak stain technique, she used it for many years, and she became increasingly adept at moving the paint across the surface of a canvas, manipulating it in different ways to create different effects. So in this work, you can see that the pores, the gestures, are much larger and more assured, and she's using a darker and deeper color palette. Whereas in a work made right around the same time, the colors are much softer, lighter, and the composition is broken up more into fragments or components. So even at this early stage, you can see a real range that she was trying to pursue in her various pieces. They did not all appear the same. They were quite different one from another. And she began to incorporate at times sort of symbols and fragments of representational images. For instance, here in a painting she titled Eden, you do discern a kind of garden-like or landscape effect. But she also includes two numbers, the number 100 repeated twice, and she also includes an area up in the top of the painting that looks like a large handprint. So these are possibly symbolic references, but we were never quite sure what they meant. And she always prized ambiguity in her abstract work, despite the presence of symbols and elements that can be recognized. Art history was also something from which she derived a great deal of stimulation and interest. And I wanted to show you this work that she made in 1957, together with its source painting, which is by the Renaissance master Titian. So the Titian painting is called The Rape of Europa. And Helen Frankenthaler titled her painting Europa after it. And you can see, if you look one from the other, you can see how Frankenthaler took a passage in that painting, which is the area where the arm of the figure in the Titian is brandishing a sort of a salmon pink cloth in the air. And you can see how Frankenthaler took that element and turned it into her own abstract composition. So it's not a one-on-one representation at all, but it's quite close in terms of the composition, the colors, and the sense of dynamism and movement that she's able to achieve in an abstract painting. Frankenthaler was one of a group of young female artists who were active as abstract painters at the time and who were showing their work quite frequently in 1950s New York. They had many opportunities for exhibitions. Their works were being collected by major museums, including the Museum of Modern Art and the Whitney Museum, for instance. And they had a kind of wonderful camaraderie, which I think is apparent in this photograph of Helen Frankenthaler together with her friends and colleagues Joan Mitchell and Grace Hartigan. And Frankenthaler, like the others, was often the subject of media attention. Life magazine, which was a very popular and very well-read magazine at that time, did a feature called Women Artists in Ascendance, and Frankenthaler was profiled there along with several of her the young generation of female abstract painters active in New York and elsewhere in the US. As her career developed, she began to receive more international exposure. The painting that she made here in 1957, which is now owned by the Museum of Modern Art in New York, received first place in the Paris Biennale of 1959, which was quite an extraordinary achievement for a young American artist. And it was included in Frankenthaler's first museum survey show, which took place in 1960 at the Jewish Museum in New York. It surveyed her 10 years of work of a young artist who was still only in her early 30s. So quite a significant accomplishment. In 1958, she married the artist Robert Motherwell, who was somewhat older than she and much better known as a major abstract painter. The two of them were married for about 12, 13 years before they separated and divorced in 1971. But their marriage was a really interesting creative partnership because they both, by that time, Frankenthaler was quite well known and quite accomplished, and Motherwell had a significant reputation and track record behind him. And they spent summers together in the seaside town of Provincetown, Massachusetts, where she had studied with Hans Hofmann many years before. And you can see Motherwell and Frankenthaler in the doorways of their respective studios in Provincetown. Her work changed and evolved in the 1960s toward a greater openness, a stronger use of geometry, and at times a more reductive, even more minimal sensibility. I think this is a good example of that, as is this painting. They both are sort of more centralized compositions. The colors are a bit bolder. The geometries are a little more present and apparent. Whoops. And it was right around this time that Frankenthaler began her first foray into printmaking. So this view of her studio is really interesting, I think, because you can see her surrounded by many different aspects of her work at that time. Paintings, you see some of the pieces lying on the floor. You see others tacked up on the wall behind her. There are examples of works on paper as well. And up on the wall, behind her head, is one of her first prints that she made in 1961, working at ULAE, Universal Limited Art Editions, where she was invited to begin printmaking. And this is a color view of that first print that she made there. So during the first decade, Frankenthaler never made a print. She was not really interested in printmaking. In fact, it was something that the avant-garde abstract artists of her time tended to be not so interested in until some of them began to experiment with printmaking at the invitation of printers like Tatiana Grossman, who was the owner of ULAE. And slowly, a number of prominent American artists began to experiment with printmaking, leading to what became known as the American print Renaissance. So Frankenthaler finally decided to try her hand at printmaking, and once she began, as she said, she became hooked. She fell in love with the process, and she continued to make prints over the rest of her career. This first one was a relatively simple lithograph, but I think that you can appreciate the relationship, I hope, between what she was doing in this early print and some of the earlier paintings that you've just seen. There was a real relationship in terms of how she was thinking about her work in both mediums. Back to painting. And for the rest of the talk, I'm going to toggle sort of between paintings and prints that she made over the years to give you a sense of their relationships. She continued in the 1960s to work with brighter colors and to make works that were somewhat more graphic. This is a good example of that, as is this work that she titled The Bay, because it was a direct reference to the bay, the Provincetown Bay, a body of water right outside her summer studio, where she would go swimming every day. And she was very enamored of water and swimming, and her love for fluidity and liquidity in the way she made her painting also, I think, has some relationship to this love of water and to the physicality of water that she experienced. But at this time also, she changed from oil paint to using acrylic paint. The properties of acrylic were very different from oil. It dried more quickly, it didn't bleed as much as oil did, and it allowed her to work in a slightly different manner. So it was a good example of how she chose to change up and vary up the materials she was using, even as a painter. The visual properties of her works really varied one from another, even during the same year. And she's an artist that has always had a lot of variety in her visual language. So this piece, for instance, which was also made in the early 1960s, was flooded with paint so that the canvas is completely, full of paint. And the paint was so heavy on this work that when it dried, it actually retained the lines and the striations of the wooden floor, the boards of the wooden floor underneath. That's how dense and heavy the paint was on this work. So she was experimenting with this way of pooling paint or making paint very light and really striving for a great deal of visual variety in each work that she made. Also compositionally, she would return to geometries and sort of framing devices of rectangles within rectangles. And you will see that kind of compositional approach in some of the prints in this exhibition as well. But this was an aspect she was exploring in some depth in the early and mid 1960s in a variety of paintings, all of which were quite different in terms of their colors, in terms of the nuances of the compositions, and always when she used a geometric form, it was irregular. She liked very much the sensation of the hand of the artist. and the human touch, as she liked to say. She even made a painting that she titled The Human Touch. This is, I think, one of her really strongest paintings of the late 1960s. It's owned by the Whitney Museum in New York. It's very large. And she titled it Flood. It could be a reference to flooding the canvas with painting, because it's another example of a piece that's very full of paint. There's no white space in this painting. Or it could be a reference to the sensation of a flood, or even the sensation of, as one writer described this painting, the sensation of not observing, but perhaps being in the space of a fiery sky at sunset or sunrise. And that sense of sort of bodily sensation or experience of light, of atmosphere, of landscape was something that was very important to Helen Frankenthaler in the making of her work. An image of the artist in summertime in one of her Provincetown studios. And then in the 1970s, her work changed further. This is a late 60s piece, actually, but it prefigures the even more spare approach that she took in the 1970s to her painting. This one is so simple, just what looks like just, 2 or 3 gestures might have served to make this painting, although of course we know there were many more gestures involved in its making. But the single color against a white ground is very powerful and very minimal, and resonates with the practices of other artists at the time. Minimalism and pop art, of course, were movements that were growing and expanding during the 1960s and 70s. And this is another example of a, well, not a monochromatic painting, but her use of a single color, this sort of deep plum-like purple, but a variety of different hues of purple and pink even within the space of a single canvas. She had a large touring retrospective in 1969 that was organized by the Whitney Museum and that traveled in Europe, another example of her international exposure. And I should mention that a few years prior, in 1966, she had represented the US in Venice at the Biennale as one of 4 artists included in the US Pavilion at that time, which was a huge honor for any artist to represent their country in the National Pavilion at Venice. These images of Frankenthaler painting, I think, are interesting because they show a couple different techniques that she used. You can see her pouring from the bucket of the paint directly onto the canvas. And then you can see her using I believe she's using a sponge, or maybe it's a brush. She used both in the other image to spread the paint. So it wasn't entirely accidental. Nothing was ever accidental with her, although she did embrace the accidental if she thought it served her visual purposes. But she was very deliberate, actually, and very structured in how she chose to compose each work. She was influential in her practice on a number of other artists, and I just wanted to show you one example here. This is the American sculptor Linda Benglis, who's still alive and working today. She saw Frankenthaler's exhibition in 1969, and even before that, she had begun experimenting with similar techniques as Frankenthaler used. She poured liquid latex from a bucket onto the floor to create floor sculptures, and then the latex would of course dry and harden after it was poured onto the floor. And one of the finished works that she made is shown there on your right, and she titled it, or subtitled it, after Frankenthaler. So it's really a direct homage. We know that she was looking at and paying some attention to Frankenthaler when she made this work. Another example of the importance of art history, of the work of an earlier master, in this case Matisse, to Frankenthaler. And if you can see them well, I'm not sure that you can, take note of the thin black lines in the Frankenthaler painting at left that you see sort of across the midpoint, and observe similar thin black lines in the Matisse. That was a device that he was using at this time, to which she responded. I wanted to show you this image of Frankenthaler in the workshop of ULAE with Tatiana Grossman and the master printer Judah Rosenberg at work on one of her woodcuts. Their creative collaboration was very fruitful and productive and lasted for several years before Frankenthaler decided to start working with Ken Tyler. This is one of the early woodcuts that Frankenthaler made while working for ULAE. She initially hadn't thought to experiment with woodcut, but Tatiana Grossman suggested it. Why don't you try it? So she decided she would. And she became very engaged with the process from a technical standpoint. She even taught herself to use a jigsaw so she could cut the blocks of wood to make a composition that resembled something that she might have done in painting. So Frankenthaler herself would have cut the blocks that were used to make this particular woodcut. This was the second woodcut she made. And I wanted you to see it because it prefigures, what we see here in this exhibition. And it also is a good example of how Frankenthaler continued to strive to achieve the effect that she wanted to get in a woodcut to resemble her painting. They made many tries, in printing this and making numerous proofs, but she wasn't satisfied with it. And she felt it didn't have the element, it didn't have the quality she desired. So she was almost ready to say, okay, let's forget this one and move on. But then she decided to whitewash, as she called it, the paper. So painting the color white over the surface of a paper before the printing, and then that gesture gave it the luminous quality, the light underlying the printed paint that she wanted to achieve. And then she was satisfied. So it was this kind of trial and error approach that she took in printmaking that began even before she started to collaborate with Ken Tyler. Back to painting of the same period. So you can see that she's, working in her paintings at a very large scale, but exploring a single color, a single dominant color, in this case, a beautiful, vibrant blue, but then a number of linear elements, horizontal linear elements across the surface with a variety of other colors to enliven the composition. Likewise, this painting made in 1976 has a similar character. It's owned by the foundation, and we lent it recently to an exhibition in Oslo, Norway, where it was juxtaposed with a painting by Mark Rothko, which you can see in that image. And Mark Rothko was an important figure for Frankenthaler. He was someone certainly from whom her work took inspiration. So it's interesting to see her paintings of this period together with his. But also to note the extreme simplicity of her work, but yet the nuance and sort of living, breathing aspect to her painting that she is able to achieve by the application of the paint. This work, in fact, was shown in London a few years ago, and a critic for The Guardian newspaper described it as a Rothko dancing wildly to jazz, which I thought was extremely funny and very appropriate, because it does, once you hear that, you can look at this and you can almost see the painting dancing wildly to jazz. This work of 1977 is another great example of how she was able to achieve a sense of atmosphere, depth, movement, and light in her abstract paintings. At this time, she was spending a lot of time in the American West, particularly in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where the colors of the landscape and the light, especially at sunset or sunrise, is very like what you see in this work. So 1977 was just 1 year before an exhibition of her small paintings traveled here to Singapore. And it was shown at what then was called the Singapore National Art Gallery. So it was exciting for me to realize that that exhibition had been presented here, and that the Singapore public and artists of that time had an opportunity to experience Frankenthaler's work firsthand. So this is one of the prints that you'll see in the exhibition, made in 1977, just a short time after she started working with Tyler Graphics. Initially, she was not so sure that she wanted to work with Ken Tyler at his workshop because she had visited it and she had felt it was a bit too industrial. He worked with very large machines and presses, and he had a big staff, and it didn't seem to have the kind of intimacy that she had experienced while working with Tatiana Grossman at ULAE. But after a while, she changed her mind, and Tyler convinced her to come and join his workshop. So she began to work with him over a period of many years. So in this print, you can see, it's a lithograph, you can see the relationship, I hope, with some of the paintings that I've just showed you. The use of a dominant color, which in this case is a kind of, sort of purpley pink, but with many variations and striations and a linear element to it, achieved through the lithograph process to mirror or match the kind of qualities that she was striving for in her paintings. This is another important woodcut that she made early on in her practice or her collaboration with Tyler. It's not included in this exhibition, but I wanted to show it to you anyway because it's a good example of how creative she and Tyler were together. When they put their heads together, they came up with some really interesting and important artworks that were able to challenge the conventions of woodcut making and printmaking. So there was a mulberry tree outside Ken Tyler's studio, and he went and got some berries from the tree, and he sort of squeezed their juice, which creates this sort of beautiful purple color. And Frankenthaler decided to try to paint with that purple juice, mulberry juice. It turned into what became a woodcut series called Essence Mulberry. And she was stimulated by the color of the juice. She was also thinking a lot about the Japanese screen format. And she used a kind of thin paper for the printing of these woodcuts and created a variety of proofs, all of which are very different one from another. And seeing them together is incredibly impressive because you get a sense of the way it was really like a trial and error process of coming up with different examples of how to do something before arriving at what she felt was right, that had the qualities that she sought. This print is included in the exhibition. In fact, I can see it from where I sit. It's behind all of you. So you can see that it's a smaller image, but it has a great deal of power and an important graphic sensibility that rivals that of the larger prints and woodcuts that are also in the gallery. And this one also can be seen in the room next door to us, Sure Violet, she titled it. And here she is working with a variety of printing techniques, sugar lift etching, aquatint, and dry point to create a composition that has numerous colors and many lines, linear elements, and striations that give it a great deal of visual interest and detail. This woodcut is not included in the exhibition, but I'm illustrating it for you because it was another example of how Frankenthaler was after an idea, after a visual idea that she had, and to accomplish it, she had to take many different steps. So the Tyler workshop was also known for its handmade paper making. So sheets of handmade paper were made for purposes of this woodcut, and she wanted like a very absorbent paper, and the paper was finally made in a kind of dusty rose color, so that when it was overprinted with the blue quality, it produced this color that's somewhere in between blue and rose. It's a very sort of interesting combination, but she also was able to achieve the effect of the print through her manipulation of the actual wood surface itself for the block. She came up with a technique that she called guzzying, which means scratching or distressing the surface of the wood in some way. She used many different ways of doing this. She used sandpaper at times. She used dental tools. She used even a cheese grater at one point. It was all with the idea of making the surface of the wood more textured so that the resulting prints would have that kind of texture on them. Back to a painting. This painting is called Eastern Light. Great example again of the atmospheric capabilities of her paintings. And then another reference to art history that I think is quite wonderful. She was looking at a small painting, a small still life by Edouard Manet, the 19th century painter, and made her own interpretation of the work, actually calling it 4EM, so making a direct homage to Manet, but reinterpreting the scene as sort of a really dynamic, explosive abstract painting without ever directly representing that fish with its tail upturned. These prints are present in the exhibition and are really, all of the prints here reward close looking. So I hope you will have time to look at each one of them carefully and slowly so that you can appreciate the great variety of detail in terms of mark making and nuance and subtlety in all of these works. This one, titled "Walking Rain," I think is sort of very beautiful in how the how the pigment reads on the surface of the painting, but also notable for the dark color, the sort of blackish. Black is the predominant color here, and it relates to a number of paintings and works of art that Frankenthaler made at this time using black and dark colors. She's usually thought of as an extreme colorist, somebody who used a lot of bright colors, pastels, lyrical colors, but she also was attracted to somber tones. And it was yet another way in which the range of her work incorporates, such a great variety of feeling, of emotion, of sensibility. This painting is right here, so you can see it directly. I was very glad to hear that STPI wanted to include a painting on canvas in the exhibition alongside the prints, because I thought it was a great way for people to appreciate the differences and the similarities between the paintings and the print practice. So as much as, well, this painting was painted around the same time as the one I showed you that was so dark. So she turns from that to something that's much warmer and richer, and I won't say brighter because it's not so bright, but it's a deeper kind of color tonality that sends yet another very different atmospheric message. So, and here, of course, we have the real thing and images of another example of the Gateway series. She made altogether 12 examples of these freestanding screens. And they were technically extremely complex. She really did something that had not been done before in the making of this project. So she'd been interested in the idea of making a screen for a while. She had seen an exhibition of artist screens, and she thought, I would like to try that someday. But it wasn't, until a few years later that she actually did. She started with the making of prints. You can see on one side of each screen has a series of, or a triptych of a print. It's the same version that you see standing here in the gallery and on the screen. But on the other side, the material is completely different. The other side is painting on bronze. So bronze gives the structure to the screen and allows it to stand upright. The work overall has been called part print, part painting, and part sculpture. And indeed, it brings together all of these various techniques. So Frankenthaler worked on the prints at the Tyler workshop with Ken Tyler and his team. And then they went together to a foundry. So where she could, experiment with the craftspeople at the foundry to make the bronze framework. And each one of those, as I mentioned, she hand painted, so it has a different appearance. If you observe the back of the screen, and you will see it is different from the example that I'm showing you. These images give you an idea of some of the processes that she employed to make these screens. So in the black and white image, you can see her examining the prints with Ken Tyler. And then you can see her at work applying the pigment, a mixture of pigment and chemicals, to the bronze surfaces to achieve that kind of beautiful greenish patina that she thought would be a wonderful complement to the very different color palette of the prints on the other side. So her last major retrospective took place in 1989 in the United States. It traveled to a number of museums there. This view shows a fragment of the installation at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. The same year, a major monograph came out on her work. I'm happy to say that the same author of that 1989 monograph is just about to release an updated, revised, and expanded version of this book on Frankenthaler. It will be a tremendous contribution to the literature, and I believe it will be available in September. So we're very excited that that is coming out. Following this retrospective, she had another, good decade or almost 15 years of work still to make. This is one of my favorite examples of Frankenthaler's work. It's called Stargazing, and it's a dazzling sort of nocturnal scene. Actually, right now, it's in an exhibition in France, in Arles, France, at the Fondation Van Gogh, Vincent van Gogh, in an exhibition called Van Gogh and the Stars. And some of her later works, in some of these works, she continued to experiment with dark colors, with geometries, and with much thicker paint. So her earlier soak stain paintings were quite thin. But over the years, she became much more interested in textural effects, in part through the impact of her printmaking practice. So in the 1990s, for instance, she made this pair of works, which both are at first glance monochromes, but yet within each one of these paintings, there is a wide variety of other color elements, and the paint is built up over the surface of the canvas through the use of gels and thick passages and layer after layer after layer of paint. So she really did change her method and challenge herself as a painter in her later years. This installation view of a show that took place last year at a gallery in New York shows us some of these later paintings, so you can get a sense of their large size. And around the same time, she was making works like this. An example of free fall. This incredible woodcut is here in the exhibition. I find it one of the most compelling of her prints because of its bold, strong, graphic quality. The unity of the composition is incredible. And to make it, she was once again, very inventive in her use of technique. She worked with paper pulp. So to make the maquette for the piece, she applied by hand elements of paper pulp on a sheet of paper, and then she manipulated them to get the kind of composition that she wanted. Once she was satisfied, stencils were made of the composition, and then the printing process could begin. So the resulting work is quite large, as you'll see, but it's also very bold and very graphic, very powerful. You can see her painting by hand some of the graphic elements along the bottom of the freefall print. And this print called Radius is also here in this gallery, made with a similar technique as freefall, the one I just showed you, using paper pulp to create a maquette. But also in this work, she guzzied the surface of the wood block so that there was a lot of texture and irregularity on the surface, so that when it was printed, some of the elements are quite thick and dense, and others are quite thin. This beautiful piece is a combination of lithography and woodcut. We see it here in the galleries. And a series of works that she made in prints called Reflections, the Reflection series, are really sort of astonishing to see as a group because there's a lot of variety in them. And it's wonderful that there are a number of these included in the exhibition. This is a unique work on paper made by Frankenthaler in the 1990s, later in her career. Large in size, probably larger than this painting behind me. But also, I think it's a great example of her use of color, bringing together colors that are often not thought of in combination. So she had this inventive sensibility to her about color throughout her career. And then this is a much smaller piece in real life, a woodcut etching and aquatint included in the exhibition. and a number of pages from an artist book that she made using a number of prints that's also here in the exhibition. She titled it, "This is Not a Book," even though it is a book, because she felt that an artist's book needed to have some kind of text, but she never came up with the right kind of text that she thought would make sense. So instead, she just decided to make a book of her images and to call it "This is Not a Book." We're coming to the final sort of chapters of Frankenthaler's printmaking practice and her artistic practice. And we're ending with some major woodcuts that she made, including a series of 6 woodcuts called Tales of Genji. She was working not just with Kenneth Tyler at this time, but with a master printer from Japan called Yasuyuki Shibata. And he helped her realize this series of prints through his expert knowledge of the ukiyo-e technique. I know I garbled that, but it's a very precise historical technique in which he was very well versed. Well, Frankenthaler challenged him to expand his approach to this technique and to really take it beyond any kind of usage it had had previously in order to achieve her vision for a series of prints that were not only large, but also very complex compositionally. What she did to move these forward was to paint directly on pieces of wood to make the maquettes. And from those pieces of wood with her paintings, handmade paper was crafted to simulate the grain of the wood on which she painted. So then, when Shibata was able to start the making of the woodcuts, he used that paper, which already had the wood grain impression in it, and that enabled the series to achieve a kind of painterly sensibility that is quite astonishing. So it was very challenging for Shibata and for the whole team there. Here's the whole group of the Tales of Genji. So you can see how different they are one from another. Each composition is quite different. They're even slightly different sizes. And during the printing process, everything had to happen very quickly. Like the paint still had to be wet so that it would sort of bleed and flow in the way that Frankenthaler desired to have those kinds of atmospheric effects that she sought. And Shibata has talked about how difficult and challenging this was for him, but yet he had to push himself to make it happen. And then Madame Butterfly, which was made in the year 2000 and is considered really one of the real tour de force prints made by Frankenthaler together with the Tyler workshop during this time. It's a triptych, so made in 3 parts, and she used a similar technique of making a maquette by painting on wood. She also guzzied the surface of the wood blocks to achieve textural effect here. And because of the large size of this image, it was even more difficult and challenging to make the print and to achieve the kind of painterly effects that have been described by a critic and curator as having a heartbreaking, evanescent quality that is suggestive of the passage of time and the fleeting nature of time. Frankenthaler's, there are 2 examples of late woodcuts that Frankenthaler made after Ken Tyler closed his workshop. And Shibata, who stayed in the United States, went over to work at another workshop called Pace Prints. Helen Frankenthaler followed him there. She had enjoyed the collaboration with him so much in this kind of creative dialogue and back and forth with all the makers at Tyler Graphics that she wanted to continue working with Shibata. And so together they made this piece and this one. And they are 2 of the latest works that she made using this medium. I think that may be my last slide. Yes, so this is my last slide. So I will conclude by just letting you know that the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation has been the fortunate recipient of Frankenthaler's collection of her own work, the work that she kept, examples of her work that she kept over the years from her student days until the end of her life. And she passed this to the foundation through the terms of her will so that we can steward her artistic legacy and lend examples of her artwork to museums and to art institutions around the world to further public appreciation of the visual arts and to inspire a new generation of creative practitioners. So, as I said earlier on, having this exhibition here at STPI is very meaningful because the kinds of creative collaborations that took place in the Tyler workshop with Frankenthaler and Tyler are also happening here on a regular basis with a current generation of contemporary artists and master printers. So with that, I will end, and I will ask for any comments, questions, any conversation that we might have. I would be delighted to hear from you all.
Do you still have her wood blocks and plates in your foundation?
Do we still have wood blocks and
Yeah.
prints in the foundation? Yes, we do. We do. We have examples from, I think, all of Frankenthaler's series because she kept some for herself. You know, she wanted to sell them, of course, and, you know, have them out there in the world, but she kept examples for herself. So yes, we do. We have a pretty strong collection of those examples of her work. Yeah. Yes, somebody in the back.
Hi, just a question about the foundation. How is it endowed? How does it function?
So the question was about the foundation, how it is endowed and how it functions. So we were fortunate that Frankenthaler was a successful artist in her lifetime. She sold a great deal of her work. When she passed away, she had significant resources. And by the terms of her will, everything came to the foundation. She had no children. So back in the 80s, she had decided that she wanted to have a foundation become active after her death to steward her artistic legacy. So everything came to the foundation. Her financial assets, her collection of her own artwork, her collection of other artists' work, her archives and papers. We also have her intellectual property and her copyright. And our mission is, as it says here up in the top paragraph, to steward the artist's legacy and to inspire contemporary, practitioners through a range of initiatives. Those initiatives are educational, curatorial, research-oriented, and philanthropic. So we use our assets, whether it's the financial assets or whether it's the artwork or whether it's the archival information for scholarship, we use all of those in service of our mission. So we welcome scholars to do research at the foundation. We lend frequently to exhibitions. We have, on occasion, made gifts of art to museums and especially to university museums. We fund scholarships. We fund various other projects, research and writing projects. We have an interesting initiative, which is quite unprecedented in the visual arts, called the Frankenthaler Climate Initiative, where we provide funding to US museums that are taking steps to reduce their carbon footprint and to become more energy efficient. So we make funds available for that purpose. Are there any other questions or comments? If not, I hope you will enjoy this beautiful exhibition that has been so expertly curated by Siwa and is a fantastic presentation of Helen Frankenthaler's graphic works.
Since you're doing different kind of funding, so how can individual artists can approach you to get some funding for their work?
So can an artist approach us to get funding? Actually, no, we only fund organizations. We do support artists through organizations, however. For instance, during the COVID period, we became quite active in helping to fund organizations that were in themselves providing emergency grants and assistance for artists that were, in hard times. So we do work of that kind, but we do not fund individual artists directly.
Okay, if there's no more questions, we'll close the session. Thank you very much to our speaker, Elizabeth, for that very, very insightful sharing. Again, this talk is held in conjunction with our annual special exhibition, which opens from today all the way till the 25th of August. It really is a very rare chance to encounter some very brilliant works straight from the vaults of our national collection, as well as all the way from the foundation in New York. So if you haven't already had the chance, please take the time to view the exhibition after this program. Please also do invite your family and friends to visit the show before it ends in 8 weeks' time. We also have a host of public programs happening throughout the run of this exhibition, so you can visit our website or our social media page to keep updated as well as to sign up. Thank you and have a good weekend ahead.